Welcome back to the StingyTrigger tabletop. This is Trigger here to do a review of an excellent gun, the Lee Enfield Ishapore 308. As always, we start off here with a little bit of history. As I like to say, if you don't know where you've been, you can't know where you're going. The Lee Enfield was the British rifle of empire. It was first introduced in 1895 as a replacement for a variety of rifles that the British were using at the time, most notably a lot of the Martin Henry and a lot of the Lee Medford rifles. And as you probably guessed, it is an evolution of the Lee Medford designs. Now, the British used this rifle during the Boer Wars. They used it during World War I, World War II, Korea. It was still in use in Vietnam when it was eventually discontinued by the British, but several other nations, most notably India, used it into the 1980s, and it is in fact still in use today in some of its variants as a dedicated sniper rifle in a lot of Commonwealth nations, along with still being the mainline battle rifle for the Canadian Arctic divisions. As you can probably guess, when it gets to be 60, 70, 80 degrees below zero up above the Arctic Circle, semi and fully automatic guns don't exactly work so great. They don't cycle properly with the extreme loss of heat from the gas blowback systems, and the lubricants start to seize up, and they simply do not run. So the Canadians still run a Lee Enfield variant of the bolt-action rifles that have been in service since 1895. So as of March 2012, the Lee Enfield has the distinction of being the longest-serving mainline battle rifle in world history, for a grand total of 117 years and counting of active duty service. The Canadians in particular are not scheduled to replace their Lee Enfields until at least 2014 and possibly longer, depending upon what they come up with through evaluations. Now, the original Lee Enfields came in a variety of patterns, and you'll see them in movies, in reenactments, and gun shows. There was the Mark I, the Mark II, the Mark III, which had a number of variants. This particular rifle here is the Mark III No. 1 variant. The Mark IV, the Mark V, which was a jungle carbine, and several later Mark versions, which were 308 conversions, as well as short pattern rifles, as dedicated sniper rifles, and as a couple of Commonwealth versions as well. As this was the rifle of empire, it went everywhere that the British Empire went. As a result, many nations used this as the mainline battle rifle for their armed forces for many years. There are Canadian Lee Enfields, there are British Lee Enfields, there are Australian Lee Enfields, there are New Zealand Lee Enfields, there are Indian Lee Enfields, there are Palestinian and Egyptian Lee Enfields. These things are everywhere. In total, it's estimated that the various Commonwealth nations have produced in excess of 17 million Lee Enfield rifles worldwide over the course of its use. The Indian government alone has produced approximately 700,000 of this particular variant of rifle, and I will come back to that a little bit later. The ironic thing about the Lee Enfield rifle is, despite its tremendous success, is the rifle that almost wasn't. During the Boer Wars, the British were armed with their Lee Enfield rifles, and the Dutch Boers were armed with Mauser pattern rifles. And at least initially, the British were getting shot to pieces by these crafty Dutch farmers with their German rifles. Well, if you're a British soldier, you want what the other guys got because you're tired of getting your unit shot away from you. And so the British began to look at a Mauser pattern rifle, thinking quite erroneously that the reason the Dutch were winning was because of the equipment that they had. And that was partly true, but it had nothing to do with the rifle itself. It had everything to do with the tactics that the Dutch Boers were employing. The Dutch Boers were setting up sniper nests and ambushes and were using camouflage. They were using guerrilla hit-and-run tactics, whereas the British were still in full uniform, in some cases, early on, still in red coats, marching around in nice neat columns trying to find these Dutch guys that kept shooting their officers from a long distance. So the British began to look into developing a Mauser pattern rifle, similar to the Mauser or the 1903 Springfield. Fortunately for the British, World War I happened. And I say fortunately because they realized that they did not have enough time to complete testing, let alone put a Mauser pattern rifle into full production. As a result, they stayed with their Lee Enfield rifles, and they served amazingly well during World War I, and in every conflict that the British were still using it as a mainline battle rifle afterwards.
It's also fortunate that they kept the Lee Enfield design so that they didn't run into the problem that the Germans did with the Maxim machine guns. Through a little quirk of history, Hiram Maxim registered his patents both in the United States and in Great Britain. However, he licensed his guns to anyone who wanted to produce them. As a result, countries like Germany, who produced vast quantities of the Maxim machine guns, had to pay a royalty not only to Hiram Maxim in the United States, but also to the British Patent Office. So for every gun that they produced, in order to shoot British troops, they had to pay a royalty fee back to the British. If the British had acquired a Mauser pattern rifle, they would have been paying a fee back to the German treasury for every rifle that they put in the field. The difference being that the Germans were putting tens of thousands of machine guns out, whereas the British would have been putting millions of rifles out. And if they had gone with a Mauser pattern, they would have been dumping multiple millions of dollars into the German coffers that probably would have kept the war effort going a heck of a lot longer than it actually did, just because they wanted to use Mauser pattern rifles.
So, the Lee Enfield served exceptionally well, and was originally chambered in the British .303. Now, the British .303 caliber is an excellent, full-size rifle caliber that was the mainline caliber that the British used, again, from the late 1800s all the way up through the end of the 1950s. The caliber is extremely strong, extremely powerful, shoots a .30 caliber round. However, it's an older style rimmed cartridge and suffers from a lot of the problems that rimmed cartridges do, most notably rim lock, especially when in an internal box magazine if it fails to feed properly. However, that didn't stop the British from using the .303 cartridge in everything that they needed a full-size battle rifle cartridge for. The Lee Enfield was chambered in the .303, the Maxim machine guns were belt-fed from .303s, the British Spitfires were originally armed with Browning .30 caliber air-cooled machine guns, again with belt-fed British .303 ammunition. The Bren gun used the .303, all of their vehicle-mounted .30 caliber machine guns were .303. Everywhere the British needed a full rifle cartridge through the end of World War II and even into Korea, they used the .303. However, at the end of Korea, with the decision to transition onto a semi-automatic and fully automatic select fire assault rifle, the British decided to go with the FNFAL. This was because it was a brand new design that was chambered in the brand new NATO 7.62x51 cartridge, the same thing that was the popular American cartridge used in the M14, as well as a lot of the Western Europe countries' preferred G3 rifles. As a result, the British .303 fell out of favor. Now, anyone who shoots military surplus will tell you that the moment your standard battle rifle cartridge changes, the old cartridges are no longer in as much demand, price goes up, demand goes down, price goes up, demand goes down, especially as more and more of the older rifles are phased out of existence and sold into military surplus or simply scrapped. If you shoot .30-06, if you shoot 7.62 by 51 if you shoot 8mm Mauser. Anyone who shoots these calibers will tell you exactly that. And the same thing happened to the Indian Army. And this is part of what fueled their decision to make the Lee Enfield Ishapore variant. The Indian Army lost a couple of pretty important border skirmishes with the Chinese. They were largely fighting up in the Himalayas, again, over their borders along Kashmir and Tibet. As you can no doubt guess, between colonial powers constantly redrawing borders, as well as just general tensions during the height of the Cold War between a communist and a democratic nation, as you can no doubt imagine, the borders were a pretty hot topic and were constantly redrawn and shifting. So the Indians got into it with the Chinese, and unfortunately for the Indians, kinda got their butts kicked. And unlike originally when the Lee Enfield was thought to have failed the British, this time it was partly true. Yes, there were many other factors that contributed, but a main part of the problem was the Chinese were using semi-automatic and fully automatic assault rifles like the SKS, like the AK-47, whereas the Indians were still running around with their Mark III No. 1s chambered in British .303. Bolt action versus semi and full auto? Well, I don't need to tell you that it doesn't matter how brave your soldiers are. If your enemies are putting out 30 times as much lead towards you, it's not going to do a whole heck of a lot. So the Indian Army looked at a possible replacement for their bolt-action rifles. They decided to go with the FN-FAL, which by the time of the mid to late 60s was becoming the rifle that was the symbol of Western democracy. It was the symbol of nations struggling against communist oppressors in order to keep their nations democratic. It was the rifle that put down terrorists, and the Indian Army decided that's what we're going to go with. They placed their order with Fabrique Nationale in Belgium, who responded with, "Guys, I'm sorry, but everyone wants this FN. We keep expanding our factory, we keep putting out more, we cannot keep it in stock. It is going to be years before we can start to get you some replacement rifles." So, the Indian government turned to its own rifle factory in Ishapore and said, well, let's just keep these 303s going. And then they took a look at their ammunition bill, and they realized that simply by switching to the .308 caliber cartridge off of the .303 caliber cartridge, the savings in ammunition costs alone would pay not just for a retooling, but for a replacement of all the .303 rifles currently in Indian service, and then some. So the Indian government commissioned the rifle factory at Ishapore to make a brand new .308 caliber version of the standard Lee Enfield No. 3 Mark I. Essentially, what you see in front of you. It's a fantastic rifle. It was exceptionally well made, and it used all original British tooling, slightly beefed up for handling the higher power .308 cartridge. All in all, they produced a fantastic gun that served the Indian Army up until the 1980s, when it was finally surplused out and largely sold on the foreign market to places like the United States, where the desire for a battle rifle that was affordable to shoot was readily available. So that's pretty much it for the history of this gun. We're going to come back in part 2 to start running down features and pros and cons. Please go and check over on that video, and I'll see you in part 2.